All right, would you like to come with me and enter the portal of the temple? You'll notice that when you enter, the stairs ascend. In a certain, notice the curve of the stairs. That's significant. It's a heliacal curve. That means a helix. And the stairs go in a numerical sequence, 3, 5, and 7. And then you get to the top, and you'll notice as you pass through the portal, there's 2 pillars. The pillars are on cubical bases, and on top of the 2 pillars are 2 globes. If you look closely, look at this one and look at this one. If you look carefully, you'll see that they're not the same. Notice the one on the left is a conventional terrestrial globe, sitting with its axis tilted 23.5 degrees out of the perpendicular. And the one on the right is a celestial globe. And here is a clue as to the work that goes on within the temple. The uniting of the 2 worlds, the terrestrial world on this column, the celestial world on this column, known as Yachin and Boaz. These were the symbolical columns that flanked the entrance to King Solomon's temple, built 3,000 years ago, which of course was just a reconstruction of much earlier temples. This is what this inscription was written in Greek over the entrance to Plato's academy. Plato was considered one of the greatest metaphysicians of the Western world. He would not teach his metaphysics to anyone who was not trained in geometry. And why do you think that would be? Because geometry developed the rational mind. And those who get deep into the mysteries know that unless the rational mind, the reasoning mind, is well developed, one can get sucked into a morass in which there is no extrication. You know the 4 tools wielded by all magicians, don't you? They're the 4 suits of the tarot cards, the cup, the pentacle, the wand, and the sword. And they each correlate to one of the spheres of the human being, the pentacle being the body, the cup being the emotions, the wand being the will, and the sword being the intellect or the reason. And as a sword cleaves asunder, this is the analytical function of the reason. And if you get caught in the thickets, in the jungle, the metaphysical jungle, you want to have a nice sharp sword to take out and wield to cut your way through the thickets. In Masonry, they talk about the 3 pillars, which you'll see coming up. 1 pillar attributed to wisdom, 1 to strength, and 1 to beauty. Because every great undertaking requires wisdom to contrive, strength to execute, and beauty to adorn. Johannes Kepler said that geometry existed before the creation. It is co-eternal with the mind of God. Geometry provided God with a model for the creation. Now, what Johannes Kepler discovered about 400 years ago was a rediscovery of what our ancient unknown predecessors understood very clearly. And this is why they incorporated geometry as the very basis for their work. What we see here is the whirling geometric exercise, the yin-yang, the polarity principle within creation. And here we see the very word creation written in Zen calligraphy. Read from right to left, we see the 3 fundamental forms of all geometry. Read from right to left, the circle, which is the most fundamental, the equilateral triangle, which is secondary, and then finally the rectilinear figure, which is the tertiary, the 3rd generation. And in all sacred geometry classes that I do, we begin by drawing the circle, learning how to draw a circle. And then from that circle, all of the geometric forms of creation can emerge. First 2-dimensional, then 3-dimensional. So this is the word creation written in Zen calligraphy using the 3 components of geometry. St. Augustine said numbers are the thoughts of God. Galileo said mathematics is the alphabet with which God has written the universe. In the Ancient of Days, he set his compass upon the face of the deep, from the book of Job. And we have the demiurge reaching out of his celestial domain, reaching down, not a mountain, but a compass with which to draw circles. And what is he about to do? He's about to set the universe into motion. And here we see a graphic depiction, time-lapse photograph, of the mysterious angular momentum that animates all of creation. Mysterious because physicists, astrophysicists, astronomers have still not figured out the source of this angular momentum that has set everything turning into these great harmonic cycles. This is a southern hemisphere image, and if you look right at the center of the image, you'll see that it's almost a little shadowed spot. If you look at the northern hemisphere, you will see there's a little white. What is that little white piece right there? Who can tell me? Who said that? Sarah, very good, Sarah. That's Polaris, the North Star, which hopefully, if you ever take my classes, I will insist that you learn to find Polaris, the North Star, because that way, if you're ever out and you get lost, you can always have a way of getting oriented. Now, you'll notice everything is spinning around, and Polaris, the North Star, is not exactly on the dead center, but it's darn close. Now, what we're looking at here is, you got a picture, you're standing on the Earth, and the Earth is spinning from west towards the east, and its axis is like an arrow pointing to the heavens, which in the northern hemisphere is pointing to that little white spot. Without that spinning, we'd be in trouble. Now, it's that spinning that translated into the Earth's weather systems sets up these kinds of spiral systems, weather systems. And on another scale altogether, we find the same geometries at work on the galactic level, because we're essentially seeing the same fundamental cosmic forces at work, both on the galactic level and the terrestrial level. And they're manifesting in this case as a particular logarithmic geometry that the ancients were actually well aware of. Protagoras said man is the measure of all things. Now, what led Protagoras to make this statement was his realization that the cosmic geometry that we find embedded in creation is also embedded within us. And that we are, in fact, like walking, living yardsticks. We are like meter sticks of the cosmic dimensions. If you hold out your hands this way, outstretch, this is what was known as the fathom, that we still call as a fathom today. It's 6 feet. A large man of 6 foot or 6'1" or 6'2" will have a fathom of about 6 feet. Fathoms are primarily used in nautical navigation. The foot that we all measure in is obviously taken from a foot. The inch is taken from the width of the thumb, right? Thumbs up. From now on, whenever you see a thumbs up, I want you to think about an inch. And that there's 12 of those inches in a foot, just as there's 12 months in a year. And just as there are 12 astrological months within the great year. The cubit comes from the Greek term cubitus. Cubitus means elbow. The cubit is the distance from elbow to fingertip. Now, in that cubit, everybody has a cubit. Hold your cubit up in front of you and feel around on your wrist, and you will find a little hole in your wrist, right in the top of the wrist that marks the center of the wrist joint. If you feel around, probe around, you'll find it. There's a hole there. Anybody find it? Now that little hole right there will divide your cubit in exactly the same proportion, the same ratio, as if you turned your cubit vertically that, and now enlarge that cubit to your full height so that your elbow is now the bottom of your feet and your fingertip is the top of the head. That hole there, which is called the space of destot, is your navel. And that proportion holds true for all of us. Now, interestingly, that particular proportion is the harmonic proportion that's at the basis of all organic life that we see. When we study organic life, we find something known as the golden ratio, or the golden proportion, or the divine proportion, the divine section. It's got many, many names. We find it all throughout nature, but we find it most prominently manifested, interestingly enough, in the human frame, in the human proportion. And this is why Protagoras said man is the measure of all things, because he knew that all of the ancient systems of metrology, that is measurement, were not based upon random lengths. They were based upon harmonic submultiples of the great dimensions that held together the framework of our universe. And it was this framework of harmonic dimension that was translated into the dimensions and the fabric of the temple, the sacred structure, so that that structure could reflect those proportions and link thereby the scale of the human with the scale of the planet. An old Masonic lecture says, if we consider the symmetry and order which govern all the works of creation, we must admit that geometry pervades the universe. The ancient philosophers placed such a high estimate upon this science that all who frequented the groves of the sacred academy were compelled to explore its heavenly paths, and no one whose mind was unexpanded by its precepts was entrusted with the instruction of the young. That's always struck me as a very interesting idea. Prerequisite for being an instructor of the young was that they understand this principle of sacred geometry. By geometry, we may curiously trace nature through her various windings to her most concealed recesses. By it, we discover how the planets move in their respective orbits and demonstrate their various revolutions. By it, we account for the return of the seasons and the variety of the scenes which each season displays to the discerning eye. And by it, we discover the power, wisdom, and goodness of the grand artificer of the universe, and view with delight the proportions which connect the vast machine. Numberless worlds are around us, all framed by the same divine artist, which roll through the vast expanse and are all governed by the same unerring law of nature. Now, this is a Masonic lecture that goes back to the 1700s, maybe even as early as the 1600s. So this was the kind of mindset that they were attempting to inculcate in the initiate into the Masonic mysteries. And here's a frontispiece to a 12th century Bible. And what we see here is a depiction of Jesus Christ in his cosmic form. Can you see what he has in his hand here? Does anybody recognize what that is? The set of compasses. Exactly. He's got the set of compasses right there. The still center. Now, when you have a set of compasses, you've got the fundamental dynamic right there, because you have one leg of the compass is fixed, is the still point, and the other leg of the compass is the moving, rotating point. And it's through the exercise of turning the compass that you then put into motion the unfolding of the sacred geometry that brings order to the chaos, and it is this order that allows, permits, and inspires the emergence of life and consciousness. And here is another from the Christian tradition depicting Jesus as the master builder of worlds, again holding the set of compasses. Now, this is not something that's now taught as a conventional part of Christianity. This goes back to the lost Christianity, the idea of God as a geometrician and Jesus as a geometrician, That is part of the tradition of Christianity of the first 2 and 3 centuries. The framework itself manifests a very interesting geometry based on the square root of 2. And when one studies this stuff, one begins to notice there are certain very small clues to hidden meanings. For example, the fact that one foot is placed right here and the other foot is outside the frame. And here is Fu Hai and Nu Qua, who were the Chinese creator gods. Now this is from the same period of time, around the 12th century. Now you'll notice, very significant, the intertwined serpentine tails. Here's that helix again, a double helix winding around. And you'll notice there are star patterns, constellations. If you look, you can very clearly see Canis Minor right here. You can see Pegasus right here. You'll notice in the hands, here's Fu Hai, the male half, and here's Nu Qua, the female half. Fu Hai, what does he hold in his hands? The compasses. And what does Nu Qua hold in her hand? A square, and what else? Plumb bob, yes. The plumb bob. What do we do with the plumb bob? If I'm holding this plumb bob up and this plumb bob is hanging perfectly still, where is the down arrow pointing? To the center of the earth. And where is the up arrow pointing? To the zenith of the sky. So by means of a plumb bob, we can create a very important primary linkage between earth and sky. The plumb bob is hanging from a right-angled square. That's the builder's square. So what we see there are the tools of the builder and the tools of geometry. And here we see, holding in his hand, the compass with which to draw the circles. Any Mason would immediately recognize the significance of the compasses, the square, and the plumb bob being associated with the 3 degrees of the Blue Lodge. You've all seen this before, right? You go through almost any small town in America, and you will see a cornerstone on a building. You probably never noted, though, that that cornerstone will almost invariably be on the northeast corner of the building, and there's a reason for that. But on that cornerstone will be this figure right here. What is this? The compasses and the square. Now the square is an angle of 90 degrees and the compass is an angle of 60 degrees. That's significant to a geometrician. And in the center we have the letter G, which what do you suppose that stands for? Well, I won't answer that, but I will let you surmise whatever you want. Sometimes we see it depicted like this. Instead of the letter G, we see the all-seeing eye. Whose eye is that? The National Security Agency? No, if we're not careful. No, that's the eye that if it blinked, the National Security Agency, along with everything else, would essentially become a figment of cosmic imagination and nothing more.